Name is Serena. I'm 31 years old. And last Thanksgiving, I sat at my mother's dining room table and watched 30 years of being the wrong daughter collapse in about 45 seconds. I didn't plan it that way. I didn't walk in with a speech prepared or some dramatic moment rehearsed in my bathroom mirror. I just answered a question my brother asked me. That's all. One honest answer, and the whole architecture of our family, the one they'd spent 3 decades carefully building with him at the center and me somewhere near the baseboards, just came apart. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened at that Thanksgiving table, you have to understand what dinner looked like when I was 9 years old. My brother's name is Troy. He's 4 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to notice anything, he was the sun our family orbited. My mother, who I'll just call my mom, had this way of looking at him that she never quite turned in my direction. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even conscious, I don't think. It was just the way water flows downhill. Troy was the direction everything naturally moved. The year I turned 9, he won a regional science fair. My mom threw a party. Actual streamers. A sheet cake from the good bakery on Elm Street, not the grocery store. My dad's coworkers came over. Someone brought a video camera. I remember sitting on the stairs in my pajamas watching adults I barely knew shake my brother's hand and tell him he was going places. 2 months later, I got a perfect score on my third-grade reading assessment. My teacher sent home a certificate. My mom taped it to the fridge, but it was gone within a week, replaced by a permission slip for one of Troy's soccer tournaments. I don't say this to sound bitter. I say it because that's exactly what it was. A permission slip. We grew up in a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, in a house with green shutters and a basketball hoop in the driveway that was always adjusted to Troy's height. My dad worked in insurance, steady job, long hours, the kind of man who came home tired and deferred to my mom on everything domestic, everything kid-related. He loved us both, I believe that, but he moved through our childhood like a guest who didn't want to make trouble. My mom made the decisions. My mom set the temperature of the house. And the temperature was always calibrated to Troy. His school fees came first. His travel baseball leagues, his SAT prep course, his new cleats, his class trips. Not because they were cruel to me, but because it was assumed I'd manage. You're so self-sufficient, my mom used to say. Like it was a compliment. She didn't seem to notice that I'd become self-sufficient because I'd learned asking didn't get me anywhere. By the time I was in middle school, I'd stopped mentioning my grades unless someone asked. I'd stopped showing my mom the short stories I wrote in spiral notebooks because she'd skim them and say they were good, and then immediately ask if I'd seen Troy's cleats. Did I know where Troy left his gym bag? Could I remind Troy about practice tomorrow? I wasn't invisible to them. That's the part that's hard to explain. I was there. I existed. They fed me and clothed me and kept a roof over my head. But I was an assumption. Troy was an investment. The year he got accepted to Ohio State on a partial athletic scholarship, my mom cried at the kitchen table like someone had handed her a winning lottery ticket. She called every relative we had. She posted on Facebook. She framed his acceptance letter. I got into the University of Michigan on an academic scholarship, nearly full ride. My mom said, "That's wonderful, honey," and asked if I wanted spaghetti or chicken for dinner. I chose Michigan. I packed my own boxes. My dad helped me load the car and hugged me at the curb and told me to call if I needed anything, and I knew he meant it, and I also knew I probably wouldn't call. Not because I didn't love him, because I'd spent years learning to need nothing from my family that I couldn't figure out myself. Ann Arbor cracked me open in the best possible way. For the first time, I was in rooms where people actually listened when I talked. I had a roommate, this sharp, funny woman named Brittna, who would stay up until 2 in the morning debating everything from supply chains to reality television, and who told me once, after I'd downplayed something I'd accomplished, "You need to stop doing that. Stop making yourself smaller so other people are comfortable." I'd never heard anyone say that to me. I wrote it on a post-it note and stuck it to my laptop. I'd always been drawn to food, not in a hobby way. In a compulsive, obsessive, I read restaurant menace for fun kind of way. I grew up watching cooking shows while Troy was at practice, taught myself to bake bread at 14 because we couldn't afford the good stuff from the artisan bakery downtown, and by the time I got to Michigan, I was the person in our apartment who turned whatever was left in the fridge on a Thursday night into something that made people stop mid-bite and go, "Wait, what is this?" I majored in business, but I spent every elective on food science, supply chain, hospitality management. I interned at a restaurant group in Detroit the summer between my sophomore and junior years and spent 12-hour shifts on my feet learning how a kitchen actually runs. Not the romantic version, the real version, with the burns and the miscommunications and the moments where everything nearly falls apart and you have to hold it together through sheer stubbornness. I graduated in 3.5 years because I couldn't afford the extra semester. Walked across that stage with a degree, roughly $4,000 in savings, and a plan so specific I'd written it out in a notes app I'd been adding to since sophomore year. My mom called after the ceremony. She told me she was proud. She also mentioned that Troy had just been promoted to shift manager at the car dealership where he'd been working since dropping out of Ohio State after 2 years. She said it like she expected me to celebrate alongside her. I did. Or I pretended to. I'd gotten very good at pretending. The plan was a food truck. Not because it was glamorous, because it wasn't, but because it was a realistic entry point with lower overhead than a brick-and-mortar restaurant, and I'd done the math down to the last decimal. I found a used truck in decent shape from a guy in Ypsilanti, negotiated him down, put every cent I had into cleaning it up and getting the permits sorted and building a menu I'd tested on every willing human being within a 10-mile radius. I named it Copper Spoon. Comfort food done right. Elevated without being pretentious. The kind of thing you eat standing up and feel genuinely good about. We parked outside office buildings on weekdays and farmers markets on weekends. By month 3, the line was long enough that I had to hire help. I called my mom when we crossed $10,000 in a single month. She said that's great, and then asked if I'd talked to Troy lately because he was thinking about trying a new business idea and she thought I might have some thoughts. I gave him my thoughts. He didn't use them. The truck led to a second truck, which led to a catering arm, which led to a small investor who'd eaten our food at a corporate event and tracked me down through LinkedIn to ask if I'd ever considered a physical location. I had considered it constantly. I'd been considering it since I was washing dishes in that Detroit kitchen at 20 years old. We opened our first restaurant, still called Copper Spoon, in a converted storefront in a Columbus neighborhood that was just starting to come up. I found a space near home deliberately. Something in me wanted to build something real in the same city where I'd learned to need nothing. The opening got written up in Columbus Monthly. A food blogger with a decent following posted about us and the reservation wait list backed up for 6 weeks. We won a local Best New Restaurant award in our first year. I was 31 years old, running a restaurant with 40 employees, a catering operation, and plans for a second location already drafted. My mom came in once early on with one of her friends. She didn't tell me she was coming. I found out she'd been in when one of my servers mentioned it. When I called her that night and asked why she hadn't said anything, she said she didn't want to bother me. Troy knew I had a restaurant. He'd been in exactly once, ate for free, told me the portions were too small, and left without tipping his server. I covered it. When he had a bad stretch, around a year before that Thanksgiving, my mom called me almost weekly. He'd lost his job at the dealership. Some conflict with management. He'd tried and abandoned a landscaping venture and then a pressure washing operation, both funded in part by my mom pulling from her retirement savings. She was worried about him. She just wanted me to know. She thought maybe I could help somehow. Maybe I had some contacts. Maybe I knew someone who was hiring. I made a few calls. Nothing came of it. I want to be honest about this part. I wasn't thinking about Thanksgiving as a moment. I didn't fly back to Columbus that November with any kind of plan. My therapist, I'd been seeing someone for about 2 years by then, had encouraged me to keep showing up for family events as long as I could do it without losing myself in the process. She said something that stuck with me. She said, the goal isn't to change them. The goal is to see them clearly and stop being surprised by what you find. So I booked a flight from Ann Arbor to Columbus, rented a car, and got a hotel room near downtown instead of staying in my childhood bedroom. That decision alone felt like putting on armor. My mom hugged me at the door in her good apron, the one with the embroidered leaves she saves for holidays. The house smelled like turkey and canned cranberry sauce, and the slightly too sweet candle she keeps burning on the mantel every November. She told me I looked thin. She said it the way she always does, with just enough concern that you can't tell if it's a compliment or a criticism. Troy was on the couch with a beer, watching football. He looked up and said, "Hey, the entrepreneur," and laughed at his own joke in that way he has, the short exhale through the nose that sounds like he's letting you in on something. He'd gained some weight. He looked tired in a way that went past tired. I said, "Hey," and kept walking. My dad was in the kitchen doing the thing he always does, standing near the counter looking helpful without actually cooking anything. He hugged me for a long time and said he'd been following the restaurant online. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, so my mom wouldn't hear from the other room, not because he was hiding it, just because he lives his whole life at half volume around her. Dinner was set the same way it has been my entire life. Troy at the head, my mom closest to him. Me across the table slightly to the side, like a chair that ended up there by accident and nobody moved it. My mom spent the first 40 minutes of dinner talking about Troy's new idea. He'd been doing some research, she said, and he thought there might be an opportunity in outdoor furniture. Wholesale, maybe retail eventually. He'd been looking at some numbers. She thought if he could just get a little capital together, some startup money, this could really be it for him. She looked at me once while she said this, just briefly. I kept eating. I've learned over the years that I can be in that room and slightly outside of it at the same time if I focus on the food. My dad asked me how the restaurant was doing. "Busy," I said. "Really good, actually. We're looking at a second location." Troy looked up from his plate. He hadn't looked up in a while. "Second location?" he said. "Big spender." He smiled like it was a compliment, but the edge on it was familiar. He's always had that edge. Even as a kid, praise from him came wrapped in something that cut. He picked up his fork and went back to the turkey and said, "So you're what? Rolling in dough now?" Pun intended. My mom laughed. My dad didn't. I said, "We're doing well." And Troy said casually, like it was nothing, like he was asking about the weather, "So what's the restaurant actually worth at this point?" Seriously. Ballpark. I think he expected me to deflect. I think he expected me to shrug it off with something humble, something small, the way I always had. I think my mom expected the same thing. I could see her reaching for the rolls, already moving on mentally. I set my fork down. I said, "We just closed a deal with a hospitality group out of Cincinnati. They're acquiring a majority stake. The valuation came in at about $11 million. The rolls landed on the table. My mom's hand was still extended toward them. Troy put his fork down. There was a silence in that dining room that I will remember for the rest of my life. The candle on the sideboard was flickering. Outside, someone in the neighborhood was setting off an early firecracker, popping faintly in the distance. My mom said, "What?" 11 million, I said again. I kept my voice even. "It's a good deal. I retain creative control, and they bring infrastructure. The second location will open in the spring." Troy let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something else. He said, "You're serious? That's a real number." "It's a real number," I said. He looked at my mom. She was staring at me with an expression I didn't have a name for. Not joy, not pride. Something more complicated, something that had calculation in it, and underneath that, something that looked almost like embarrassment. She said, "Honey, why didn't you tell us? You should have told us. We're your family." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the science fair cake. I thought about the permission slip on the fridge. I thought about the phone call after my college graduation when she'd spent more time talking about Troy's promotion than asking about my plans. I said, "I tried to tell you. I've been trying to tell you for years. You just weren't listening." She started to say something about how that wasn't fair, how they'd always supported me, how they'd always been proud. I didn't interrupt. I let her finish. And then I said, "You supported him. That's not the same thing." You flew out to move him into his dorm. You gave him money for businesses that never launched. You called me every time he was in trouble and asked what I could do. But when I opened a restaurant, you came in once without telling me. And you left without saying hello. My dad was very still across the table. Troy's face had gone through several different expressions and landed somewhere between defensive and deflated. He said, "So what? You want an apology? This is your big moment?" I said, "No. I'm not here for a moment. I came home for Thanksgiving. I'm telling you what's true because you asked." My mom said, "But this is wonderful news, Serena. 11 million, we could." She stopped herself and I watched her mind work and I knew exactly where it was going before she said it. "Troy has this idea. For the furniture business. If you have investors now, real investors, maybe you could put in a word." There it was. Not congratulations exactly. Not, "I'm sorry I didn't see you." Just the same reflex she'd had my entire life. Troy. Always Troy. Even now, with the number sitting in the middle of the table like a lit flare. I pushed my chair back. My dad looked at me. I looked at him, and I held his gaze for a second, and he gave me this small nod, almost invisible, that felt like the most honest thing anyone had said to me in that house in 30 years. I said, "I hope dinner's good, I'm going to head out." My mom said, "You haven't had dessert." I said, "I know." Troy didn't say anything. He picked up his fork. I took my coat from the hook by the door, the same hook I'd used since I was small enough that my coat didn't reach the second rung, and I walked out into the November cold. The rental car was at the curb. I sat in it for a moment with the heat running and the radio off, watching the light in the window of the house I grew up in. I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not grief, exactly. Something quieter than both. Like a knot that had been pulled tight for 30 years had finally, without ceremony, simply let go. The text started around 9 that night. My mom asking if I'd gotten back safely, slipping in. We should talk more about everything. Maybe I'd misunderstood certain things. Troy, shorter. Just, you didn't have to make it weird. No apology, just an observation. Like I was the one who'd done something wrong by telling the truth. My dad texted me separately just once. He said I should have spoken up more. "I'm proud of you. Always have been." I sat with that message for a long time. 3 weeks later, my mom called to tell me that Troy was having a hard time. The furniture idea had stalled. He was behind on some bills. She wondered, very casually, very carefully, whether I might be in a position to help him out. "Just a small loan," she said. "Family helps family." I said, "Mom, I love you. I can't keep watching you make his problems my responsibility." I said it as gently as I could. She got quiet. She said she understood. I don't think she did. Not fully. Not yet. But I think something landed. I didn't write a check. I didn't call Troy's landlord or his bank, or anyone who might smooth things over. That's not cruelty. That's just where I finally had to draw the line between caring about someone and funding a pattern that was never going to change unless someone stopped enabling it. The restaurant's second location opened in March. We got reviewed in a regional food magazine. My GM, who has been with me since the food truck days, cried a little at the staff dinner we threw to celebrate. I made a short speech and barely got through it. My mom came to the opening. She drove herself. She arrived early and stood near the back, and when she saw me across the room, she made her way through the crowd and she hugged me. And this time it wasn't the polite hug from the doorway. She held on for a second longer and she said quietly into my shoulder, "I didn't see you the way I should have. I know that now." It wasn't everything. It wasn't years of one-sided birthday cakes or the framed acceptance letter that was never mine, or the phone call after graduation she spent talking about someone else. It didn't undo any of that, but it was real. And it was hers. And I chose to take it for what it was. I'm still in therapy. I'll probably be in therapy for a while, and I've made peace with that. There are still family dinners where I have to work to stay grounded, where the old reflexes pull at me, where I want to shrink back into the chair by the baseboards and wait to be noticed. I don't do that anymore. I built something real, not to prove anything to them, not to put a number in the middle of a Thanksgiving table. I built it because at 22 years old in a borrowed kitchen in Detroit, I felt alive in a way I never had in my childhood home. And I followed that feeling until it became a life. If you're the one who never had the cake from the good bakery, the one whose achievements ended up behind someone else's permission slip, the one who learned to need nothing because needing things felt pointless, I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me when I was sitting on those stairs in my pajamas. You're not a background character in your own story. You only feel that way because someone else set the lighting. Change the lighting. You'd be surprised what you find when it's finally aimed at you. I still think about that candle flickering on the sideboard. The way the room went so quiet I could hear a firecracker popping somewhere down the street. $11 million sitting in the middle of my mother's Thanksgiving table like something that had no business being there. And the first thing she thought to do with it was figure out how it could help my brother. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the number. Not the silence. The reflex. How automatic it was. How deep it ran. What I've come to understand is that the way things turn out isn't random. It's the accumulated weight of every choice made over years, sometimes decades. My mother chose over and over to pour everything into Troy and assume I'd manage. Troy chose over and over to let that happen, to coast on what was handed to him instead of building anything that was genuinely his. And I chose, starting somewhere around the age of 12 when I stopped waiting for my turn, to build something that didn't depend on anyone's approval to exist. Those choices compounded. That's just how it works. Not punishment, not fate, not anything you'd find in a sermon. Just the honest arithmetic of what you put in and what you don't. Troy isn't a villain. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to frame him that way, and it wouldn't be honest. He's a person who was handed so much external validation so early that he never had to develop the internal kind. That's its own damage. My mother loved him in a way that ultimately didn't serve him. And I think somewhere under all that beer and deflection at the Thanksgiving table, he knows it. The things we're given without earning can hollow us out just as surely as the things we're denied. What kept me moving, all those early mornings and the burns on my forearms and the nights I sat alone in that food truck, counting receipts and wondering if I was delusional, was something I can only describe as knowing. Knowing that the work was real even when nobody was watching, knowing that the food was good even before anyone reviewed it, knowing that my instincts were worth trusting even when my family treated them like a hobby. That's not arrogance. That's what integrity actually feels like from the inside. It's quiet. It doesn't need an audience. You do the right thing, the careful thing, the honest thing, because the alternative is building on sand, and you've seen what that looks like up close. Britta told me years ago to stop making myself smaller so other people were comfortable. It took me a long time to understand that she wasn't just talking about personality, she was talking about vision, about the willingness to look at what you're actually capable of and not flinch from it, not edit it down to something that fits more easily into the room you happen to be standing in. I built Copper Spoon one shift at a time, one honest plate at a time. One employee I believed in before they fully believed in themselves. And when the number finally came, it wasn't luck. And it wasn't a surprise to me. Not really, because I'd been inside the work every day, and I knew what it was worth. If you're somewhere in the middle of your own quiet grind right now, unseen, underleveraged, tired of waiting for someone to notice what you're building, I want you to hold on to this. The notice was never the point. The work was the point. The character you're forming inside the work, the discipline, the clear-eyed honesty about what you're doing and why, that's what actually lasts. The rest tends to follow.